August 20th, 1786, in Versailles, within the king's private study, Charles Alexander de Cologne, 46 years old, holds a position that carries immense strain in France. He serves as Controller General of Finances under Louis XVI. He has just completed assembling the true figures, not the official reports previously presented to calm the court, but the actual condition of the French treasury. He places the document before the king. The yearly shortfall now stands at 112 million lever. Total national obligations have climbed to roughly 3.3 billion lever. Close to one-half of state income is already consumed, only to service interest on debts accumulated from military campaigns in America and India, conflicts that France did not even need to fully win in order to claim political success. For the aristocracy, Cologne's recommendation amounts to something close to a challenge against the existing order. He puts forward a uniform land levy that would require both the nobility and the clergy to contribute. The proposal cannot pass through the established judicial councils. Because of this, he persuades the king to call an assembly of notables in 1787. 144 of the most influential nobles and high-ranking clergy in France are gathered to approve the measure directly. They reject it, not because the figures are inaccurate, but because resolving them is not considered their responsibility. Cologne is removed from office within a few months. His successor achieves no better outcome. The continued fiscal deadlock extends for another 2 years, until Louis XVI has no remaining alternatives and convenes the Estates General in 1789. That body will, within months, declare itself the National Assembly and begin dismantling the entire structure of the French state. No one present in that room in 1786 understood they were witnessing the opening stage of revolution. They believed it was only a financial meeting. The common narrative of 1789 centers on ideas: liberty, equality, and enlightenment thought breaking through centuries of feudal tradition. Yet the mechanism that initiated the collapse of the Ancien regime was far less idealistic. It was a taxation structure that had become unable to sustain the state it was meant to finance. France during the 1780s possessed one of the most productive economies in Europe. Scarcity of wealth was never the core issue. The real failure lay in how revenue was extracted from that wealth. Over time, exemptions, privileges, and legal carve-outs had accumulated across generations, each justified individually, but together they made consistent taxation nearly impossible. The nobility controlled about 1/4 of French land, yet contributed almost nothing in direct taxation on it. This exemption originally stemmed from their obligation to provide military service to the crown, an obligation that had become largely symbolic by the 18th century. The clergy held around 1/10 of the land, collected tithes directly from peasants, and only provided the crown with voluntary payments that they repeatedly negotiated downward. The remaining burden fell on common people through a mix of direct taxes, salt duties, and a dense system of local tolls. Those least able to bear the cost carried the heaviest load. This alone was not immediately fatal. What made the system collapse was debt. France financed its involvement in the American Revolution and earlier wars against Britain primarily through borrowing rather than taxation. Raising taxes on a population already strained by indirect burdens risked unrest. Borrowing against future income appeared, to each successive finance minister, as the least resistant option. By 1788, the state could no longer sustain itself through ordinary borrowing. Fresh loans were needed just to cover interest payments on earlier debt. Each effort to close the widening gap was repeatedly obstructed by the very groups benefiting from the exemptions that created the imbalance in the first place. The revolution did not ignite with a prison assault or a street uprising. It started with a set of financial records that those with the authority to act on them refused to accept. Well, now the comparison shifts to France in 2025. The parallel is not symbolic but structural. A state whose spending commitments have exceeded its income base, trying to implement reforms that are systematically blocked by the groups positioned to lose from them. By the end of 2024, French public debt stood at around 3.3 trillion euros. That figure, by coincidence of scale, reflects the same 3.3 billion lever once presented to Louis XVI, expanded roughly 1,000 times through 2.5 centuries of monetary change. As a proportion of output, France's debt reached about 112% of GDP. Within the Eurozone, only Italy and Greece sit at higher levels. The annual budget gap reached roughly 6% of GDP in 2024. This is about twice the 3% limit set under European Union fiscal rules. France has remained above that threshold for much of the past 15 years, across both expansion and crisis cycles, suggesting a structural imbalance rather than a temporary one. France has therefore been operating in persistent breach of the fiscal ceiling embedded in European Union rules. In December 2024, the government of Prime Minister Michel Barnier fell after losing a no-confidence vote. The trigger was his attempt to pass a budget combining higher taxes with reduced spending, aimed directly at narrowing the deficit. It marked the first collapse of a French government through a no-confidence vote since 1962. His successor, François Bayrou, remained in office only briefly. He encountered the same constraint. Any serious correction to the deficit required either tax increases or spending cuts large enough to prevent a stable parliamentary majority from forming. The 2024 National Assembly is divided into three roughly equal blocks. None can govern independently, and none is willing to grant political advantage to the others by supporting unpopular fiscal adjustments. In effect, the chamber mirrors Cologne's Assembly of Notables, recreated as a fragmented parliament. The financial diagnosis itself is broadly accepted. The dispute centers on distribution. Who bears the cost of adjustment? That question, under the current political structure, has no workable resolution. Within this context, wealth taxation becomes central to the parallel with the 18th century. In 2017, Emmanuel Macron abolished France's wealth tax, known as the Impôt sur la Fortune, or ISF, replacing it with a narrower levy focused mainly on real estate assets. The reform was justified as a measure to prevent capital and wealthy residents from relocating to Belgium, Switzerland, and the United Kingdom. Supporters framed it as economic competitiveness. Critics described it differently, as a shift that reduced the contribution of high wealth groups to public revenue, echoing earlier debates over privileged exemptions. In 2018 and 2019, the Yellow Vest protests erupted following increases in fuel taxation, reflecting broader tension over how fiscal burdens were distributed. Measures that function like the salt tax under the Ancien regime fall most heavily on working class and lower middle class populations in rural regions and outside major cities. These are areas where daily life depends on car usage in ways that wealthier urban populations are less affected by. The protests that followed forced the removal of the fuel tax entirely. The reform of the wealth tax remained unchanged. This recreated a structural pattern similar to 1789. Indirect taxation on everyday consumption became politically explosive, while direct taxation on concentrated wealth remained politically resistant. The pension reform protests in 2023 followed a comparable trajectory. The policy increased the retirement age from 62 to 64. It was presented as a fiscal necessity. Demonstrations continued for months across the country. The government ultimately enforced the reform by activating a constitutional mechanism that allowed it to bypass a parliamentary vote. The immediate budget issue was resolved, but the outcome increased a broader perception among large segments of the public that standard democratic procedures were no longer capable of producing workable fiscal decisions. Credit rating institutions now evaluate the situation in a way that mirrors, in formal structure, the role of earlier fiscal reporting in 1786. They assess a gap that the political system cannot close. Fitch Ratings downgraded France's credit rating in April 2024. Moody's followed with its own downgrade in December 2024. During the same period in which Michel Barnier's government collapsed, S&P Global Ratings issued another downgrade in 2025. Each assessment pointed to the same underlying issue, a deficit path that requires political agreement to correct, within a system that has repeatedly failed to generate such agreement across multiple administrations. This is not unique to France. It reflects a recurring pattern seen in fiscal crises across history. The diagnosis is widely shared. The numbers are publicly known. The groups whose contributions would resolve the imbalance are structurally positioned to resist those adjustments. The crisis persists until an external force overrides the normal political process. In 1789, that force was the collapse of royal authority and the formation of a new governing body that no longer operated under the previous rules. This channel exists to examine the Compte Rendu before it becomes the Estates General. Charles Alexander de Cologne died in exile in 1802, having witnessed from across the Rhine the complete destruction of the system he had attempted and failed to repair. He was not mistaken about the figures. He was constrained by a structure that could not politically absorb what the numbers demanded. France today presents its fiscal reality openly. The data is published on a quarterly basis, downgraded annually, and debated within a legislature that cannot agree on how to distribute the burden of correction. The mechanism that produced 1789 did not depend on a single actor or isolated decision. It required a prolonged imbalance between obligations and revenues, combined with a political system unable to assign the cost of adjustment. Both conditions are present in France today. Subscribe if you want to continue observing the mechanism before it turns into the headline. The question remains open. Did Cologne fail because the Assembly of Notables prioritized protecting their exemptions over solving the fiscal crisis? Does modern political fragmentation in France create the same incentive structure across three competing blocs? And is there any current political configuration capable of passing the necessary correction, or does history suggest that adjustment only arrives after institutional breakdown? Present your argument.